Welcome to This Medical Life podcast. These are the stories of medicine with Steve Davis and Dr. Travis Brown. This is the story of Crucifixion. Dr. Travis Brown, this topic of crucifixion and its links to Easter, it's been featured in blockbuster classic movies over many, many years, from the serious to things like Monty Python's Life of Brian. But in this episode, we're looking at it from a medical perspective.
This has been a topic I've wanted to do for a few years now since we've been doing this podcast. And I wanted to take a deep dive into this because it really is, if you look at the symbolism of Christianity and you walk into someone's home and you actually see a crucifix. Now, we understand what that means. Like, that's, Christian, this is, faith and someone believes. People have it hanging around their neck. When you take a step back and you actually look at it, you sit there and go, well, this is actually an ancient torture, cruelty device that people have just in their house. And it's sort of a bit of a... you tread sort of two paths there. You sit there and just go, well, what actually happened? The crucifix was a torture device. In fact, it was one of the cruelest torture devices humanity has ever come back at. And then you look at it the other way, it's become a symbol of Christianity, which in some places you would say is of humanity, of forgiveness. And so you have these two sort of worlds. And when you look at it, what the crucifix is actually... when you look at it in a physical or a medical sense, it is actually someone hanging there who are in such physical stress that the body is overcome and dies.
And I think, and depending where our listener sits on any of the spectrum between being religious or Christian or not or something else, I love the fact that humans can hold competing concepts at once in tension, because I feel at one level the cross is just now seen aesthetically and it's light and we don't have any deep necessary connection to it generally. But if we did meditate on what that would have meant for any human to have been nailed or tied or strung to a cross, but then I guess other people would be wearing it as a sign of liberation or transcendence from that. So it's what was left behind. It was throw your worst at me and I've got over it. There's so much that you could. And I feel like in popular culture in particular, it's almost glib in a way that it's just such an easy thing to sling around the neck or hang.
It's a piece of jewelry.
Yeah.
And that's again, now this is such an area, again, this is one of those areas that there has so much meaning attached to it, this cross. There's a historical, there's an archaeological, there's a medical part, again, which we'll take today, but there's also a religion, there's a faith base. And this has actually been examined quite a bit in modern history and modern medicine, because a lot of people have attached so much weight to this and said, well, what is this crucifixion? What did it actually mean? It was a torture device, an execution device for the worst criminals in, ancient Rome. And look, the amazing thing is, even though we know it was done, we actually don't know much about it today because it was done 2,000 years ago, but it hasn't been done much since then. And so people have started to theorize, and they did studies. There's even been people who have done reenactments and tried to actually work things out, as crazy as that sounds.
I did see a great movie called Jesus of Montreal, which didn't know full reenactment, but they really got into that aspect of enacting it.
But there is people who have actually done like reenactments and stuff to that point. And so then they've seen the assessment. Now that's been in an environment that's sort of been for a study. But what do we know about crucifixion? And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to examine this a little bit further, get us into a bit of the context of what it meant. And so you have to go back to ancient Rome. You actually have to go back to, let's contextualize this. Now, if we look at Rome, well, it was a republic. And so it was, the political power belonged to the people. Now, they had elected officials and a Senate, an assembly of citizens who voted on laws and elections. And they had 2 consuls, if we look at, and they were the people who shared power at the time, but were also in charge of like the Senate and, doing laws and policies. If there was any wars, the consuls would lead the armies into war. Mm-hmm. But it was also hierarchical society. It was also, governed, not led, but, influenced from wealthy individuals and elites and families. And so they had enormous power over those who ruled. But Rome was also a belligerent society, very aggressive. Okay. And so now Rome and Roman citizens were superior. So that was not unusual. Again, almost all ancient civilizations, particularly large ones, thought they were superior to others, and it was their job to govern, to rule, to overtake, and they would enslave other cultures. Rome wasn't unique in that. That was part of the world. And so they were warring nations, and as soon as you start to get warring nations, you start to get subhumans and people that
didn't count.
Exactly, didn't count. They'd be worthy to be slaves in society. And so this is where you get that supremacy kind of mentality that we are better than these other people. We will subjugate these people. And this is where you get all these genocides, ethnic cleansing, entire populations wiped out. In fact, if you do read the Old Testament, it was the godly duty, yes, to wipe out other people. And so there is ancient cultures, and Rome's not unique in this, there was a brutality and cruelty as societies. That was the way they lived, certainly from our eyes anyway. But it was governed by laws. It was governed by a judicial system, and torture was an integral part of the Roman judicial system. Now, we have some writings and some legal documents from back then, the civil law of 6th century. So this is Corpus Juris Civilis. And this is from the Emperor Justinian in the first. And they talk about the due process and procedural law.
Torture and confessions. It is customary for torture to be applied for the purpose of detecting crime, but confidence should not unreservedly be placed in torture. Slaves are to be subjected to torture only when the proof against them is lacking only their confession. The confessions of accused persons should not be considered as proofs of crime if no other evidence is offered, because the evidence obtained by torture is weak and dangerous and inimical to the truth. Most persons so despise suffering that the truth can in no way be extorted from them. Instead, they prefer to lie. If anyone voluntarily confesses a crime, faith should not always be reposed in him, for sometimes one makes a confession through fear.
And so the amount and type of torture was also based on social rank.
Torture and social rank. In the prosecution of public crimes, judges should not begin the investigation by resorting to torture, but should first examine all the evidence. If, after having done so, they think that torture should be applied to ascertain the truth, they should resort to it only where the rank of the persons involved justifies such a course. Soldiers are not to be subjected to torture unless they have been dishonourably discharged. Slaves can be put to torture not only in criminal cases, but also in those involving the payment of money, where property is entrusted to them for deposit or loan, or for other purposes authorized by law. When a gladiator or some person of this kind must serve as a witness, his evidence is not to be believed unless he is subjected to torture.
And so torture is ingrained. You could go into the court and be ordered to be tortured to get your confession or to get. This was part of the system. So this was...
Wouldn't that make legal shows so much more interesting to watch?
And this was Rome. This was ancient Rome. Like violence was part of society, and then torture was part of that. And so the way they tortured people, well, okay, there was first, they did mechanical stretching. So if you had pulleys and levers and everything like that, you would strap people's arms together. So you had the lyre strings to begin with. So, and then you would pull apart, their limbs if you could. There was something called the wooden horse, where you would actually stretch a person along, effectively trying to dislocate their arms and legs, their joints.
Do you know there are Tory Conservative MPs who pay a fortune for that experience?
and then there's the rack, which people will be familiar with. This is a wooden rack that has wheels attached, and you would actually pull apart a person until the joint effectively breaks. And this was a part of a torture device, and people, if they had this to the extreme lengths, would probably remain lame for the rest of their lives.
And you're talking ancient Rome here.
This is ancient Rome. And so then they also had physical types of punishments, aside from that one, which is physical as well. But this was where they had whipping. Flagellation, scourging is another word for it, which we will come back to in a little bit, because that's important with that. You had branding and tattoos. So if hot irons, pokers, the classic Roman type one is they would actually brand your forehead. And so you would actually have a hot iron put in there, and this was either to label you as ownership or to tell about your crime or something like that. This was a visible way of doing things. They also had beatings, of course. They could burn you with hot pitch or burning oil. You were also able to, they would get people to stand on hot plates, effectively melting skin of the feet, and torture until, and there was also waterboarding. And so these were punishments for crimes. And again, as you saw, social rank would actually order you as to what kind of punishment you could receive. And this was some of the punishment for the crimes.
Penalties for non-capital crimes. Crimes which are not capital entail penalties that are either pecuniary or corporeal. It's not customary for all persons to be whipped, but only men who are free and of inferior station. Penalties for capital crimes. Some criminal offences are capital and some are not. Capital crimes entail the penalties of death, the loss of civil rights, or servitude. For capital crimes, the most extreme penalty is death by hanging or burning alive. The next most severe penalty is labour in the mines. After that comes deportation to an island, and finally, the mildest form of capital penalties is perpetual exile, which carries with it the loss of citizenship and confiscation of all property.
So our listeners will have noted there's actually no mention of crucifixion in there. And this is because the document is actually from the 6th century CE. And so this is a few hundred years after crucifixion had actually been banned. And this is because the banning was done, which we'll come back to it, but probably because it was a mix of the emperor at the time was Christian, and this had some symbolic value with regards to it at the time. And so you heard about death by hanging. Yes, that was one way for someone to be executed. One of the most honourable execution was a beheading. And so this was reserved for people like senators and governors and high officials who had had capital crimes, so rebelling or anything like that. There was also execution by animal. So, usually a version of entertainment, so sent to dogs, animals, lions, tigers, whatever. And then the one that we mentioned, which is scourging. So this is whipping. And this was a punishment, but this could also be an execution form. And this was where they were whipped. So a flagrum where essentially they had multiple leather cords. At the end, like it had 3 knots, or it would have bony fragments, or he would have bits of metal, and people would be whipped. And so what would happen is the victim or the person who was the criminal would be tied to a post, stripped naked, and then they would be just repeatedly whipped with this. And again, it would tear all the skin, muscle, connective tissue. They would lose a lot of blood. It was on their back, on their buttocks, on their legs, and occasionally they would also do the front. And this would result in like severe pain, significant blood loss. You would often have fainting, which was common. The amazing thing about this, we know so much more about whipping because whipping was only outlawed into the 20th century. And so if you look at the Australian criminal history, this was something that we would often have prisoners whipped in early colonial society. They would have medical staff to make sure the person was fine. When they fainted, they would throw them into the salt bath, wake them up again, put them back on the rack and get them whipped again. And the average amount of whips, the minimum was 25, but the average was 25 to 30. Not only that, they would use the cat o' nine tails. You're familiar with that?
I have heard of that, yes.
And so that's a whip with 9 straps of leather that would also have things embedded like, gravel or glass or metal into it. And so they would be whipped. And so you have to say something about modern, Australian society, that we can take the ancient Romans to another level of whipping. But this was torture. Now, again, this was part of our society in modern, but this was also part of ancient Rome society, where they would torture people because that was part of society.
At some point, medically, Dr. Travis Brown, you'd almost want to opt for crucifixion compared to some of these, wouldn't you?
Well, I think crucifixion was the worst of the worst because they mixed them all up.
Okay.
As we will see.
Dr. Travis Brown, I've had a moment of quiet meditation now to cleanse my subconscious of what you've just taken us through. But there's more on this story of crucifixion, isn't there?
We need to look at what is crucifixion. So in ancient times, it actually wasn't uncommon for people to see people hanging on crosses or trees. This was actually a relatively, let's say, widespread form of execution. This was for people who were criminals, worst of the worst. This was rebellion people. This was slaves who had done, rebelled against their masters and fought and murdered people, There are instances actually in history that are written about where thousands of people were crucified at one time. There's the Third Servile War in 73 to 71 BCE. So this was a slave rebellion led by the gladiator Spartacus. He accumulated about 70,000 men to fight the Romans. This is clearly it's a slave rebellion, so they built up over years. And the consul Crassus at the time was actually elected to crush this rebellion because it went for a few years, and ended up defeating them. They ended up capturing 6,000 slaves who had rebelled, and their punishment was mass crucifixion. So on the Appian Way, the road to Rome, every 100 meters or so, they had a crucified slave who had rebelled. And this, this way is about 100, almost 200 kilometers. And so you would have just been walking along seeing people crucified on cross. There is Flavius Josephus who was a Roman citizen, wrote about this.
They were first whipped and then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died, and were crucified before the wall of the city. The soldiers, out of wrath and hatred they bore, nailed those they caught to the crosses in different postures by way of jest.
There was a siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. This is when the Jewish population had a rebellion against the Roman rule. This took 4 years. Ended up, the Romans needed about 50,000 to 70,000 soldiers, again, to crush this rebellion. And it's said that the Romans crucified 500 people a day, particularly people who would be leaving Jerusalem to try and get away from things. And so Lucius Annus Seneca wrote about seeing these events.
I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with their head down to the ground, some impaled, others stretch out their arms.
So crucifixion was a punishment. It was an execution, but it was also a warning. They would often have labels and titles across the cross. Do not do what this person did. And this is what the person did. It was a warning. This was an announcement. Okay, this could happen to you if you do the wrong thing. And so it was a punishment mainly for non-citizens of Rome. This was the lower classes and slavery. So there is Cicero, who was a famous Roman statesman, wrote about this.
To bind a Roman citizen is a crime. To flog him is an abomination. To kill him is almost murder. To crucify him is what? There is no fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a creed.
And so crucifixion wasn't just a punishment and execution. It was a humiliation. Now, this crucifixion, actually, it's not really quite known where the origins came from. Now, it's likely that it came from the Assyrians and Babylonians. Again, another culture with extreme violence in its history. And it's believed that Alexander the Great saw this and then brought this back to Europe. And, as a most brutal form and a degrading form of punishment. And the Romans saw this and then took it on. And they took it on for the next 5 centuries. So this was just like a long time of punishment.
And then you had the Vikings would sometimes kill hundreds and hundreds of people and leave them not quite crucified, but then Vlad the Impaler over there in Hungary and those regions would have hundreds or thousands of people impaled left in the field.
And so this is one of those things that you hope it's behind it, but it is, again, this crucifixion. You said, when you look at it, what are we actually looking at here? And so the amazing thing is there's no instructions on it. There's no sort of ancient Roman document saying this is how you do it. Effectively, people just did it. And it was, as you heard from the authors, there was a variety of ways of doing this. This was, there was some, crosses were in different shapes and sizes. You had a big X sometimes where they would just, post one, look like an X. You had a low cross. You had a high cross. You had what they called a tau cross. And so that's looks like a capital T. But then you had the Latin cross, which looked like a sort of a lowercase t. Sometimes, again, as we mentioned, you just have a post. Sometimes you'd have a tree. But what it was sort of made of is what they call the stipes. So this was the upright post, and then you had the patibulum, which was the actual crossbar type thing. And the crossbar is what people would actually have to carry there. So normally they would put the post in to the ground first because it needed to be sort of stable, and then they would actually take the person up with them attached to the crossbar and put them on. And so the nails that they used were often 10 to 15 centimeters. And so where they would have to go is they'd have to go through the wrist. And the reason why they had to go through the wrist or the, forearm was because that's where connective tissue, if you just put nails through the hand.
Yes, which is that's what we think of.
Yeah, but that would not be enough to hold your weight. And so the tissue, it would actually just rip out. And so your entire weight on nails through the hands would not be enough. And that's why you would actually have to go through the wrists and through the forearms. And so this is one of those things that they would be nailed through the wrist to that piece of wood. They then would be hung up. Now the feet, people think, you'd have a seat or, a footrest. No. And the reason why they didn't have that is because you would have had to put that on the post and work out where they are. You wouldn't care. This person's about to be executed. So the feet were actually nailed beside the post through the heels. And so we actually
straddling,
on either side. And now we actually have archaeological evidence for that, because there was a person who was found in an archaeological dig, the remains found with a actual nail stuck in his heel. And so it was pushed on the side through. And so this person was buried. He had fractured ribs. He had 12 nails next to his body, and also the 13th was stuck in his heel. And so, again, not only that, the crossbar had to be carried by the victim normally. So this was also a form of punishment.
And just on that, they're carrying it, but they're nailed to it as they carry it.
No. So they would carry it and then get there and be nailed to it, because it would be impossible to do that. And then it was customary, before they would actually carry that, to be whipped. So you were actually tortured, put on this, whatever strap to, whipped as much as they wanted to be whipped. And then, again, in this, there was taunting. There was mocking. These were criminals who were less than nothing. They were about to go to die, and they were sort of the worst elements. So people walking along or going to walk to their death were then just jeered at as they did this, with, whatever skin they have left on their back, bleeding everywhere, and having to drag this, the crossbar. And so this was... Also, not only that, when people were put onto the cross, soldiers were there to make sure that no one took them down. And so they were left there to die. And that's what the crucifixion is. Like, the amazing part of crucifixion is you sit there and just go, the body is in such a state of stress, of physical stress, pain and agony, that eventually it's overwhelmed and dies. So nothing actually causes you to die, so to speak, except for sheer stress. And so there's been lots of theories as to how people died. Like, doctors have actually sort of written articles how they die, and there's a whole range of theories, and chances are it's a mix of them. People talk about cardiac rupture and heart failure, arrhythmias, hypovolemic shock, so the blood that you lose, asphyxia. So, unable to breathe, acidosis. Some people even said, shock or pulmonary embolus. And so this is just, again, and also you're out in the open, exposure to the elements, and it's just, people would starve. The idea was not to die within a few hours. The idea was...
Because that would be humane, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't even know if there's a word you can use for that. This is someone hanging there, eventually their body being just physical stress, eventually dying. And so the dominant theory about how people would die was actually asphyxia. So you would end up suffocating. And the reason why I say that is because, one of the common practices, if they want people to die quicker, they would break their legs. And so people would often use their legs to sort of prop themselves up. And as soon as you started to break their legs, they would end up dying quickly. And so there's many different forms of, what people thought, whether you'd get an embolus going through from the legs or anything to that effect.
But legs would not be easy to break.
Well, they just, again, this is ancient society, so I'm sure they knew what they were doing, and it would just be something like a hammer onto the legs. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about crucifixion. We're talking about now early Christianity. Again, we talked about the symbol of the cross. When we talk about early Christianity, there's actually not, when we look at Christian art, there's no real reference or depictions of the cross. And this is because it was still considered cruel and gruesome method of execution. And it's only several hundred years later that you see it begin to become a symbol of Christianity. And this, as we mentioned, it was outlawed by Roman Emperor Constantine in 336 CE. And this is most likely because he became a Christian himself. And so there was more symbolism, but this cruel torture device. And so this is where we find. So it wasn't until the 2nd to the 5th century that you started to see the cross as a symbol of something more than a torture device.
Dr. Travis Brown, I think we're in the final act now of this episode. I don't know that I can experience Easter the same.
And that's what I sort of wanted to look at that from. I guess, people in my small group will probably sort of turn around and say, yeah, this is a Travis-esque kind of approach. But I wanted to sort of look at this as sort of just a completely different perspective. And the amazing thing about all of this is if you look at the Bible, you actually turn there and say the crucifixion story of Jesus of Nazareth is an amazing primary source of watching someone die on a cross. And if you look at his story, if you look at the story of Jesus, just this crucifixion story, and you remove all sort of, knowledge and everything behind it, it's actually it's a tragic story of betrayal, injustice, and cruelty. We have a primary source of seeing this. Multiple sources there, and again, if you get into the weeds of it all, you can talk about all the sources behind it, and that's fine. But this is a person, Jesus of Nazareth. It starts out as a betrayal. His friend turned him in to the authorities. These are the authorities were the priests, the teachers of the time. Judas conspired with the chief priest to have him arrested. Now, they wanted to kill him. And they wanted to kill him because of his teachings, because he actually challenged the religious status quo. So they arrested him. His friend helped. He became court. Jesus came before the council of elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and he was accused of blasphemy. Now, we don't think about blasphemy as being much of a crime these days, but it was a capital crime. And for most of human history, it actually has been a capital crime. You could be stoned to death within several years, within the last few centuries, because you went against the church or against gods or anything like that. And so
there are still countries in the world where it is.
Right. And this is a disrespect. This is a contempt. This is a reverence of God or gods. And so, the punishment was execution. Now, often punishment was stoning by death. Now, they questioned Jesus, and in their own minds, they said he was guilty of blasphemy. And so they took him to Pontius Pilate. Now, he was the Roman governor of the province of Judea. And Pilate questioned Jesus. And he said, "You've been accused of blasphemy." And the priest argued vehemently that he was guilty. But when Pilate questioned him, he didn't find anything wrong. None of these questions make me think he's guilty at all. There's nothing this man has done. And so the priests weren't going to let it go. And even with this, he agreed to punish Jesus, even though he hadn't done anything, and then let him go. But that wasn't good enough. The priests actually completely disagreed. Now, this was a time of the festival, and so it was customary for a prisoner to be released. And so Pilate went to the crowd and said, okay, well, we have Jesus of Nazareth, or we have Barabbas. Okay? Now, the problem is Barabbas was an insurrectionist and a murderer, and he said to the crowd, well, who do you want me to release? And the crowd said, Barabbas. We want release Barabbas. And even though Jesus of Nazareth hadn't done anything, Pilate disagreed with him by washing his hands, saying, I'm done with this, you do what you want to do. And so it wasn't just that he was innocent, being sort of guilty by mob. They wanted the worst punishment and execution that the Romans had. They wanted crucifixion. So Pilate didn't seem to bother him too much, that an innocent man was going to give this execution.
There is no evidence to suggest there would be too much of a care factor.
And so he was then given the treatment. So he went to the governor's palace, where he was stripped, where he was tied to a post and whipped. Then, now, the Jewish law is a maximum of 40 whips, whereas Romans don't have a maximum, so they could whip as much as they wanted to. He was also given the usual mocking, taunting treatment, and this being the, Messiah, so to speak, that he was argued by the priests as being. He was given a scarlet robe, he was given also a crown of thorns. And so then he was forced to carry his crossbar. But he clearly struggled with this. Now, this was really unusual that someone forced a passerby to carry the crossbar with him. So, the Romans aren't known for compassion. So how weak must have you been to go along that, taunted all the way? And then the crucifixion site was out of the city. He was offered wine and gall. So this has myrrh, which is meant to be a numbing effect to help, hopefully with what's going to be, put down. And then eventually he was forced onto the crossbar. He had nails driven through each wrist. He was lifted onto the cross, which had the title King of the Jews. And then his feet were held against the post and nails pushed through either side. The crowd, people in the crowd, there were people who would have grown up with family and friends who have known. You would have had passerbys just jeering and taunting because that's what people did with crucified people. And the next day was the Sabbath. And the priests didn't want any bodies on cross for this special Sabbath. So that is why the soldiers were ordered by Pilate to break the legs of anyone who was on the cross. Now, Jesus was already dead by that stage, and so they didn't, but they shoved a spear into his side. Now, what they said is water and blood came out. So what happened is that's most likely a cardiopulmonary effusion, and that would have been caused by the severe stress that's happening, or a cardiac tamponade. And so we know that then he was pronounced as dead.
Afterwards, Joseph of Arimathea, who had been a secret disciple of Jesus because he feared the Jewish leaders, asked Pilate for permission to take Jesus' body down. When Pilate gave him permission, he came and took the body away. Nicodemus, the man who had come to Jesus at night, also came, bringing embalming ointment made from myrrh and aloes. Together they wrapped Jesus' body in a long linen cloth with the spices, as is the Jewish custom of burial. The place of crucifixion was near a garden where there was a new tomb never used before, and so, because it was the day of preparation before the Passover, and since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts on social media. Dr. Travis Brown can be found on X. His username is @Dr. Travis Brown. That's Dr. Travis Brown. And Steve Davis can be found on LinkedIn. Go to linkedin.com/in/The Real Steve Davis. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.